Back when I was studying for my master's degree, I was living in a rented townhouse with an old college friend. She worked full-time hours, while I picked up odds and ends at a local coffee shop, meaning she could cover her costs with ease while my wages only just covered half of the rent. She was always okay with supporting me in that sense. She pretty much paid for everything, whereas I merely pitched in with groceries occasionally. I felt like a total bum sometimes, but she'd always cheer me up whenever I did and explained that it'd be me paying for bougie things once I had some fancy high-salary job. She was an amazing friend to me in that way, and we lived like that for almost 2 years. Until one day, she sat me down for a little talk. She'd fallen in love and planned to get married. The only thing was, they'd met online and the guy lived out in Sacramento. They'd already discussed living situations, and he'd made it clear that he couldn't relocate due to his mom's poor health. So after thinking it over for a week or two, she decided to move to California so she could be with him. I was happy for her, don't get me wrong. It sounded completely insane at first, but then the more we talked it over, the more it became obvious that she was crazy about him, and from what she told me, I couldn't blame her. He sounded like Mr. Right, all right, and as sad as I was to see her leave, I knew that she was able to look after herself. But then there was the problem of rent. There was no way that I'd be able to pick up enough hours to cover all the costs, not completely anyway, so if I wanted to carry on living in what was a pretty nice place, I'd have to ask the landlord about finding myself a roommate. The landlord sympathized and agreed to help me find a roommate, but insisted on being part of the vetting process. Obviously, that's their prerogative, and I trusted them to find someone reliable and chill, but I was still sort of nervous about the process of living with some total stranger. A few weeks go by, my old college friend moves out, and I'm just waiting on the landlord to be in touch about my new roommate. I texted her about it, and she replied with something like, "Almost on meeting with potentials, should hear from me in the next few days." It had all been agreed that I'd continue to pay 50% of the rent should the landlord fail to find anyone before it was next due, so I wasn't worried about the timescale or anything. I just sat back, carried on with my work and studies, and just waited to meet my new roomie. And then a few days later, just like my landlord had said, there's an unexpected knock on the front door. Outside on the step is a real plain-looking guy in his late 30s or early 40s. He's got boxes under each arm, a big smile on his face, and addresses me by name as he introduces himself as my new roommate. I was a little taken aback because my landlord hadn't given me any advanced word about anyone moving in, but since it fit with this whole time scale that he'd given me of a few days, and the guy seemed to know me by name, I figured that it was all legit. I kept the door open for the guy as he started to move some of the smaller boxes out of a U-Haul that he had outside. But as he sort of did all that by himself, I crept off into the kitchen to call the landlord. They didn't pick up the call, so I just left a text and then got back to what I was doing. The next thing I know, I hear the sound of a drill coming from downstairs. I go check it out, wondering why the hell this guy might need a power tool to get his stuff moved in, and it's not the guy at all. It's a locksmith, and they're changing the locks. Again, I'm a little taken aback, but once the locksmith told me that he had a new key ready for me and that he'd been hired by the landlord on account of the new tenant, I just nodded and went back to what I was doing. Only once the guy had moved all of the stuff in and there was a new front door lock did the landlord manage to get back to me. Not out of negligence either, just out of how busy they were. I asked them if they'd chosen a roommate, and they said yes, that they'd be over in the next few days to move in. They hadn't picked up the key yet, but they let me know as soon as they did, so I knew when to expect them. I remember kind of freezing as if to be like, oh no. And then I just asked my landlord, "Did you have the locks changed?" When they replied with a confused no, I think I just about sighed all the air out of my body, and over the course of the next few minutes, we established what should have been obvious from the get-go. A total stranger had just moved into this house with me, and my landlord had absolutely zero clue who this person was. We agreed that I should call the cops and get the guy arrested for trespassing, and although it had severely freaked me out at first, the fact that he knew my name gave us a huge clue as to who he was. My landlord had mentioned me to a number of the potential tenants, one of whom was a man in his late 30s to early 40s, who sounded a lot like the guy who had just so brazenly invaded my home. My landlord thought that his name was Brad or something like that, and he hadn't been anywhere near a favorite to move in. But apparently, Brad had taken it upon himself to do just that. When the cops showed up, I expected them to walk in, arrest the guy, then drag him out by his arms. After all, he had zero evidence that he even lived there, and I was ready to get the landlord on the phone to prove it. But then the cops walked into his bedroom, talked to him for like 20 minutes, and then came out looking exhausted. Brad had shown them a lease signed by two parties, meaning from their end everything just seemed absolutely kosher. I told them that it was impossible, that whatever documents he'd showed them had to be fake, but they explained that it wasn't theirs to judge. On top of that, all the legal stuff had to go through the landlord, not me, so once again, I had to just sit back and wait while this total stranger and obvious psychopath slept just feet away from me on the other side of the wall. Problems came almost immediately, with the first being his refusal to pay for utilities. This resulted in us getting the power shut off for an entire day until I literally begged friends and family for a few bucks here and there, until I finally had enough to get the lights turned on again. Meanwhile, Brad, I honestly never did figure out his name, just kind of made do. He made a show of it too, as if to say, nothing you can do with me to make me move out of here. Again, you think once we proved that his lease was fake that the cops would just come and arrest him, but after living in a place for a certain amount of time, city law states that they're legally a tenant, meaning you can't just throw them out. You need to go get an eviction notice, which again takes time, and all the while the landlord is losing money and I'm losing my mind. It looked like we were going to have to just live like that too, in a kind of legal, social nightmare for the foreseeable future. But in the end, we got a lucky break. Well, lucky in some ways, unlucky in others. There was a long, slow build-up to it, but eventually I started screaming at Brad and getting in his face, and he hit me. And he hit me so hard enough that he actually drew blood, which finally was what I needed to actually get him arrested, and in that time, me and my landlord jumped into action. In our city, there's a statute or precedent or whatever legal thing which states that an emergency eviction notice can be served if a tenant is convicted of a violent crime. We'd obviously have to wait for a court date and maybe even an eventual guilty verdict for that, but thankfully, it came in due course and we were able to evict him. To this day, I still can't believe someone would be so brazen as to do something like that, and I still count myself lucky that things didn't escalate beyond just common assault. Because something tells me that Brad is capable of way worse stuff than that. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.